following program is a production of the Fairfax Network, Fairfax County Public Schools, funded in part by the Virginia Satellite Educational Network.
This program was made possible through generous support from the Donald W. Reynolds Foundation to George Washington's Mount Vernon Estate and Gardens. Slavery at Mount Vernon is a co-production of the Fairfax Network and George Washington's Mount Vernon Estate and Gardens.
Hello, I'm Larry Earl, Manager of Planning and Administration of the Historic Area Division for the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. Welcome to our program on slavery at Mount Vernon. In the next 45 minutes, we will answer questions from students in our audience, as well as those watching in classrooms across the country. Joining me in this Distance Learning Center at the Donald W. Reynolds Museum and Education Center to answer these questions are Philip Morgan, Harry C. Black Professor of History at Johns Hopkins University, and Dennis Pogue, Associate Director for Restoration here at George Washington's Mount Vernon Estate and Gardens. Later in the program, we will be joined by Ruhulamin Quander and ZSun-nee Matema, who are direct descendants of two enslaved women who lived and worked at Mount Vernon under Martha Washington's supervision. Before we begin the questions and answers, let's take a look at this short video about the growth of slavery at Mount Vernon.
The institution of slavery dates back to antiquity. It arrived in the Americas with the European colonists. In Virginia, where tobacco was the colony's primary cash crop, slavery took root as early as the 17th century. By the early 18th century, the system flourished, and thousands of enslaved Africans were sold each year to labor in the tobacco fields, as well as to serve in the homes of the colony's elite. The system of slavery that developed in the American colonies was known as chattel slavery, whereby a slave was the absolute legal property of its owner. George Washington was born into a family and a society that accepted the idea of slave labor. Although not at the highest level of that society, Washington's family was still a member of the elite landed tobacco culture society, which was dependent upon the labor of slaves. Washington became a slave owner at the age of 11 when his father Augustine died, leaving young George 10 slaves. In 1754, Washington began leasing Mount Vernon from the widow of his older half-brother Lawrence. He inherited the estate outright upon her death in 1761. Mount Vernon was comprised of approximately 2,000 acres and 14 slaves. In 1759, Washington married the wealthy widow Martha Dandridge Custis. The marriage brought him an instant family, Martha's 2 children by her first husband, Daniel Parke Custis, as well as 1/3 of all Custis property, including an additional 84 slaves. These slaves were referred to as dower slaves. Because Daniel Custis died without a will, by Virginia law, 1/3 of his property went to his widow for the duration of her life, but with certain restrictions. Martha Washington could not free those slaves, and if she sold them, the monies raised would revert to the Custis estate. Furthermore, all dower slaves and any children born to female dower slaves would revert to the Custis estate upon her death. 11 of the dower slaves came to Mount Vernon with the newly married Mrs. Washington in 1759, bringing the estate's enslaved population to approximately 50. The period of 1759 to 1775 was a time of tremendous growth at Mount Vernon. Washington expanded his land holdings, switched from tobacco to wheat as his cash crop, and opened a merchant mill. The slave population grew through purchase and natural increase, although by the late 1770s, averse to splitting apart families, Washington stopped selling slaves without their permission. By 1799, the year of Washington's death, Mount Vernon had grown to 8,000 acres divided into 5 farms. Living on the estate were about 340 men, women, and children, which included the 6 members of Washington's immediate family and hired white workers such as overseers, farm managers, millers, and the housekeeper. The remaining 316 were slaves. 123 were Mount Vernon slaves, 153 were dower slaves, and 40 were rented slaves.
Let's start with a question from Miss Lloyd's class at Peru High School in Plattsburgh, New York. They would like to know, how did nationalism and other imperialistic ideas contribute to the institution of slavery in America? Or is the institution of slavery the first imperialistic idea that the United States embraced? Philip, you think you can answer that question?
I think it's a tough question, actually. But I would say that slavery existed in both empires and nation states. It wasn't either or. I would say that the first imperialistic idea perhaps the United States had was actually taking over land from the Native Americans in the West. But you could say that slavery had certainly an expansive element to it. So you can certainly say, for example, the annexation of Florida or the Louisiana Purchase or the annexation of Texas, and there was even expectations of taking over Cuba. These were imperialistic adventures that were meant to allow slavery to expand in scope. So in that sense, I think there was an imperialistic element to slavery in the United States as well.
Thanks, Philip. Mr. Ebner's class in Churchill Junior High School in East Brunswick, New Jersey asked, what kind of economical impact do you think the United States would have had if slavery had been abolished in the 1820s? Dennis?
Well, in terms of economic impact, I think maybe another question is how much did the United States suffer from continuing to have slavery as long as it did? Another 40 years after 1820, the South, of course, was even more entrenched with slavery. The slave population continued to increase, to grow. And so by the time slavery was finally abolished after the Civil War, it had a really huge impact on that part of the country. If slavery had been abolished 40 years before in a less difficult situation, that I think probably the overall impact on the country would have been considerably less, although the South still would have had, of course, to find a way to make do without the labor force that they had been dependent on for so long.
Great. We have a question from the audience.
We know that George Washington inherited his first slaves when he was just 11 years old. Did he have any personal servants?
George Washington did have personal servants. He had many. Perhaps one of the most famous is a fellow by the name of Billy Lee, or William Lee, who George Washington had as his personal manservant or valet. Billy Lee rode with him throughout the Revolutionary War. He was actually also one of the only individuals freed immediately in George Washington's will. There are many others, like Frank the Butler, his brother, and many others like Peter Hardeman, even the horseman. Our next question is from our studio audience as well. We have Alex, who has a question.
How were slaves treated differently in the 1700s versus the 1800s?
Phil, how about you?
That's also an interesting question. I think you could say that in the 19th, I assume we're talking about the difference between 19th century slavery and 18th century slavery. I think the material conditions for slaves could be said to have improved by the 19th century than they were in the 18th. Slavery was perhaps a little less cruel than it had been in the 18th century, but maybe the psychological dependence and the restrictions on manumission, you could say that slavery was tighter in the 19th century than it had been in the 18th century. I think you could say that family life certainly developed more considerably in the 19th century than it had in the 18th. There was more Protestantism, more Christianity amongst the slaves in the 19th century than there was in the 18th century. More slaves were native born in the 19th century, whereas in the 18th century there were Africans still in the country and there were children of Africans. So again, there was a different mix of a different type of slave, you might say, in the 18th as opposed to the 19th century. And you could say that planters thought about their slaves differently when they were dealing with native-born slaves as opposed to Africans, who they might have thought as being less civilized, for example.
Dennis, could you add just a little bit more to that?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. During the course of the Revolution, I think there was, sort of a movement. Thinking, I think, really changed a little bit about slavery. And folks like George Washington, for example, I think his ideas on slavery really did change over the course of the Revolution for a variety of reasons. And people have argued that there was a greater interest and sympathy throughout the country for abolition of slaves right at the time of the Revolution. And then within not very long after that, there are a number of events that seem to have gone counter to that. There are some slave revolts in Santo Domingo, for example, that I think really caught a lot of people's attention and really put a lot of fear in the white population. And so I guess I feel that in the years following the revolution, that first part of the 19th century, attitudes, I think, hardened a bit. And I think that it became less and less likely for a wide support for the abolition of slavery in those years.
Those are both great answers. And when you also think about slavery in the 18th and 19th century, you have to think about African American culture. That in the 19th century, a truly distinctive African American culture is visible and has emerged in the Americas. So you see things that, as Philip said, from Africa to the America, you see the connections and the thread. And you also have, in this abolitionist period, people of African descent working to end slavery when it becomes unpopular with the vast majority of whites. We have a video about the life of slaves here at Mount Vernon that will add more to this topic.
An 18th century plantation was like a small town. At its peak, the population of Mount Vernon was approximately 340 individuals who lived and worked on the estate's 5 farms. The Mansion House Farm was the seat of the plantation, and its dependencies or outbuildings were home to most of the plantation's skilled artisans. Washington's agricultural production took place on the 4 outlying farms: River Farm, Muddy Hole Farm, Dogue Run Farm, and Union Farm. George Washington was a meticulous businessman and manager who was intimately familiar with the workings of his farms and other industries. Reporting directly to Washington was the farm manager, whose chief obligation was to ensure the smooth operation of the plantation and to direct the overseers of the 4 outlying farms. The white and enslaved overseers supervised the activities of the enslaved workforce. Washington's slaves worked 6 days a week, Monday through Saturday, from sunrise to sunset. The length of the workday changed with the seasons. In the summer, when the sun comes up at 5 o'clock in the morning and doesn't set until almost 9 o'clock at night, the slaves would work as many as 15 hours a day. Winter hours were much shorter. Existing records tell us that the slaves were given 2 hours off during the workday for breakfast and dinner. In addition to Sundays off, the slaves had some holidays during the year. Washington gave most of his slaves 4 days off at Christmas, 1 day for Easter and another for Pentecost. Some of the Mount Vernon slaves, such as blacksmiths and cooks, lived where they worked. Until 1792, the majority of the Mansion House slaves resided in a 2-story wooden dwelling called the House for Families. It probably housed about 60 slaves. During his presidency, Washington tore down the House for Families and replaced it with a barrack-style quarters in the wings on either side of the greenhouse. This was the primary living area for most of the Mansion House farm slaves. Others lived in small wooden huts, which were either single or duplex in design. These huts were similar to slave housing found at the outlying farms. There is some evidence that the quarters at the outlying farms were often impermanent in nature and could, as Washington once directed, be picked up and moved to another location. Slaves were given a rationed amount of food. Adult working slaves received a daily ration of slightly more than 1 quart of cornmeal and 5 to 8 ounces of salted fish. Occasionally, they would also get buttermilk and extra rations of fresh or salted meat, such as pork, beef, or mutton. Slaves were allowed to use land near their quarters for garden plots. Many also kept chickens and ducks for food and to sell at market. Slaves were issued 2 sets of clothing annually, 1 for winter and 1 for summer. Each slave was issued 1 blanket per year. When a woman delivered a child, she was provided with a blanket for the new baby. Medical care was also provided, and George Washington's accounts reflect payment for medical treatment for the slaves. Although Virginia did not recognize slave marriages, Washington did, and marriage was the norm for the Mount Vernon slaves. Marriage provided stability and encouraged births. The status of a child followed the maternal line. If a child's mother was a slave, so was the child. A child born to a free woman was also considered in the eyes of the law to be free. Perhaps most importantly, marriage provided slaves with a sense of continuity, family, and community. However, depending on their jobs, husbands and wives did not necessarily live on the same farm, often resulting in separation of families. Children usually lived with their mother. Spending off time with friends and relatives was very common. Slave children, too young to join the workforce, appear to have done small jobs for their own families. As soon as the child was of an age to join the workforce, generally between the ages of 11 and 14, children became part of a transitional group called working boys and girls who assisted on the farms. An exacting taskmaster, George Washington expected the Mount Vernon slaves to work hard and produce much. He was often disappointed. He tried both reward and punishment to induce compliance. However, there was no real incentive for slaves to work harder. Slaves used a variety of means, both passive and aggressive, to rebel against slavery. Passive rebellion, such as breaking of tools, being sick on a regular basis, and completing assigned tasks at leisure, was common. Washington noted and was often frustrated by these occurrences. Although George Washington had stopped selling slaves by the late 1770s, he used other forms of punishment. One could be demoted to a lesser job, perhaps on another farm away from your family. Privileges, such as going to the market, could be taken away, and in extreme cases, corporal punishment was used.
Our next question is from Mrs. Coleman's class at Cocoa Beach Junior High School in Cocoa Beach, Florida. How much free time did slaves have for themselves? Dennis.
Well, as the video said, the slaves were expected to work from sun up to sundown 6 days a week. And in the summer months when the sun comes up early and goes down late, that means you've got about 15 hours when you're supposed to be working. The wintertime, it's a little bit easier because of the change of the season. But essentially, the slaves were expected to be available, ready to work at just about any time their master needed them to do it. Of course, the slaves here at Mount Vernon, there were house servants that were living very near the mansion, and then there were slaves who were living at the outlying farms. And some people have argued that the lives for the house servants was easier because they were near the mansion and they had better clothes and access to better food and things like that. But to think of it another way, they were there at all times. And I think that the expectation was that those house servants would respond to any needs that the family had. So obviously a difficult situation. In the fields, of course, you're working very, very hard. You're doing manual labor, actually hoeing and working in the fields. So the situation was different for different folks in different situations. But the expectations, I think, were the same.
You'll find also here at Mount Vernon that, as the video said, we saw in the segment, that some families were not together. Husbands and wives lived at different places. So in the evening, some of the enslaved community would do what they call night walking, going to the outlying farms or from here, the main house, to, like Muddy Hole or vice versa, to see their friends and loved ones, as well as just to have a little bit of rest with family. Go ahead.
I'd just say Sundays, Sundays were the one day that they did have, and the occasional holiday as well. So I think Sundays would be a time to play, rest, pray, and also work on your own garden plots as well. It was also a time of work for many slaves because that was the one time you could earn a bit of money on the side for yourself.
Thanks, Phil. Let's take a question from our studio audience. Michael.
Yes, hi, my name is Michael Allen, and I attend Mount Vernon High School. And the question I wanted to ask was, did George Washington treat slaves better than slaves were treated at the time?
Phil, would you like to answer that?
And that's a very difficult question because if you read travelers who come to Mount Vernon, they give you different impressions. So you have to try and judge how accurate they were. Some people argued that Washington treated his slaves much better than was the prevailing norm. And then you find others who say actually he treated them more severely, that he barked out commands, that he was kind of aggressive. And we've heard on the video he was very exacting and demanding taskmaster. So in that regard, you might regard him as tougher than probably the average. He did at one point say no more corporal punishment on Mount Vernon. So he said to the overseers, put away your whips. So in that sense, that's probably rather unusual for an 18th century Chesapeake master. In that way, I think you might say in that regard, you might say he was actually a better master, if you like.
Dennis, do you have a brief comment?
Yeah, and to follow up on that, we know from Washington's correspondence he had an overseer named Crow, and Washington writes that he's concerned about Crow's punishment, and he writes that Crow sometimes let his passions override his judgment when he was correcting the slaves. And so that obviously, first of all, tells us that it was part of the job of the overseers. They were the ones, they were the mid-level managers who were expected to make sure that their people were doing what they were supposed to. But Washington, at the top of the management pyramid, knew about these folks and had a sense of how they approached their job. And in this case, he was concerned that Crow may have gone overboard in his corrections.
Now a question from Miss Barnes, class at Silverton High School in Silverton, Oregon. George Washington was a very progressive farmer who tried new things that were out of the ordinary. Do you think that the slaves helped him refine these processes? And what did they do? Dennis?
Well, of course, they did everything. And early on, Washington was a tobacco planter, like everybody else was in Virginia. So the field slaves were essentially doing hoe agriculture. Tobacco is planted by hand. You have to use hoes to cultivate it. It's a very, very labor-intensive crop, which is one of the main reasons why slavery was so valued in 18th century Virginia, because tobacco really required lots and lots of labor to make that work. Over time, Washington changes from tobacco to wheat cultivation for a lot of reasons, mostly economic reasons, that he can't grow really good tobacco, and so he changes to wheat so that he can make more money. And of course, the slaves are doing all of that as well. The video mentioned that one of the issues with slave labor, of course, is a lack of incentive. Just because George Washington wants you to work hard, and just because George Washington has a new idea on how he wants to fertilize the fields, or he wants to develop a new plow, or do a variety of things, it's up to the slaves, of course, to actually implement those ideas. And, well, what do you know? They don't have a whole lot of incentive to make that change. What is it? What's in it for them? To work harder, to learn new things, to try to carry through on these ideas that Washington had. So clearly, the slaves are the ones that are making it all work. But I think there's a pretty good disjunction between Washington's ideas on how he wants the plantation to operate, maybe, against what the slaves are used to doing and their expectations of what their role is.
We have another question from our audience. Ryan, what's your question?
Ryan Baker, West Potomac High School. We've learned about passive rebellion. Did slaves ever run away from Mount Vernon? If they were caught, how were the slaves punished?
Yep. He had about 50 slaves ran away from Mount Vernon over the period from 1760 to 1799. And there were two major collective rebellions when running away, when 4 Africans ran away early on in his period, and then during the Revolutionary War in 1781, 17 slaves ran away together to the British. So, and then throughout the whole period, there's always 1 or 2 a year running away. How would he punish them? If they ran away more than once, for example, he sold 2 or 3 of them to the West Indies. He sold them a long way away to a tough life in the Caribbean on the sugar plantations. They inevitably would be whipped, generally speaking, when they came back from a flight, from an absence. Sometimes some masters did worse things, like amputations even. Cutting off of toes for running away. Washington, to my knowledge, never did any such thing, and as I said, he cut down on the use of the lash over time, but still, you would not, a runaway would be punished when they returned in some form or fashion. He didn't have, it's hard to, was this a large number, 50 over a 30 or 40 year period, 1 or 2 a year? Probably not very much. Didn't really impact the efficiency of his plantation inordinately. And as I say, there were some who ran away more than once, and if they did that and they became an incorrigible runaway, as Washington referred to 1 or 2 of them, he'd get rid of them. He'd sell them.
Fantastic. We have one other question from the audience. Muhammad, what's your question?
Yes, I'm Muhammad from West Potomac High School, and I was wondering, why did slaves follow the condition of their mother and not their father? And if their father was free, why then, in the eyes of the law, weren't their children?
Well, I think very quickly before we move on, it's important to note that the law in Virginia required that the condition of the child be the condition of their mother. This makes slavery hereditary. Once that slavery is hereditary, the masters have a natural increase in their property. This is actually contrary to English tradition, where the condition of the father is the condition of the child. if this were to happen in slaveries where sometimes masters would have relationships with their slaves, that slave could be free. So in Virginia, the law is that the condition of the child is the condition of his or her mother. But let's take a look at a video about manumission, which is a formal act about freeing slaves. We'll see more.
George Washington spent 8 years leading the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. Much of his time was spent in the North where, although legal, slavery was far less common than in his native Virginia. He saw firsthand an economic system that did not depend upon slavery. Perhaps more importantly, the ideals for which he was fighting directly opposed a system that viewed human beings as property. By the end of the war, he saw African American troops fighting side by side with whites in the struggle against the British. He had also heard the ideas of close friends, such as the Marquis de Lafayette and John Laurens, who opposed the institution of slavery. It is almost certain that George Washington saw the irony in this situation. By 1794, this attitude was clearly expressed in a letter written to a friend.
Were it not, then, that I am principled against selling Negroes as you do cattle in the market, I would not, in 12 months from this date, be possessed of one as a slave.
There was also a strong economic reason for Washington's changing attitude toward the use of slave labor. He was a very practical man, and both his calculation of the fiscal return on slaves and his experiences at Mount Vernon made him question the economic viability of the system. At Mount Vernon, Washington was responsible by law for feeding and clothing a community of more than 300 people, almost half of whom were either too old or too young to work. As a businessman, this may have affected his views on slavery. Whatever his reasoning, we know that his attitude toward slavery began to change, and in 1778 he instructed his farm manager at Mount Vernon to stop selling slaves, stating that he was opposed to breaking apart families. In 1786, he wrote to a friend that he would like to see a plan adopted by the legislature for the gradual abolition of slavery.
I never mean, unless some particular circumstance should compel me to it, to possess another slave by purchase, it being among my first wishes to see some plan adopted by which slavery in this country may be abolished by slow, sure, and imperceptible degrees.
On August 18, 1799, in a letter to his nephew, Robert Lewis, Washington wrote,
I am principled against this kind of traffic in the human species, and to disperse the families I have an aversion.
George Washington explored various means of freeing his slaves. However, he also recognized the impact manumission would have on the enslaved community when the Washington slaves were freed and the Custis dower slaves remained enslaved. Over the years, intermarriage between the groups had helped shape the Mount Vernon community. Many Washington slaves were married to dower slaves, and their freedom would inevitably separate families. Washington made the provision in his will, which he wrote the summer before his death, to immediately free his former manservant Billy Lee and the remainder of his slaves upon the death of his wife. Mrs. Washington did not wait until her death in 1802. Instead, she freed all of Washington's slaves on January 1, 1801. It was a day of celebration and sadness, as many families were impacted by separation. Upon Mrs. Washington's death in 1802, the dower slaves were divided among her 4 grandchildren, the Custis heirs. Records indicate that a number of Washington slaves were able to earn the money necessary to purchase family members from the Custis estate.
Joining us for the rest of our discussion are Ruhulamin Quander, a descendant of Nancy Carter Quander, and ZSun-nee Matema, a descendant of Caroline Branham, both women enslaved at Mount Vernon. Thank you very much for participating in our program. Our next question is from the 8th grade book club at W.R. Thomas Middle School in Miami, Florida. If George Washington was so passionate about freeing the slaves, why didn't he do it before he died or as a part of his presidency? Any of you like to take that?
Well, I think that the reality is it was an economic situation, and it was also a social situation. I wouldn't want to simplify it too much, and I've always said that I've held George Washington accountable for the fact that he enjoyed the full use of all of the monetary and social contributions of his slaves, but then he arranged for his will to free them after he no longer needed them. And I think that this, as great a man as he was, and I give him a lot of credit, he also demonstrated that he did have feet of clay in that respect. And I do hold him responsible for that, and we do say that in our family from time to time.
Phil, do you have any additions to that?
Well, I mean, I agree with Mr. Quander to some degree, but at the same time, he is the only founding father to free his slaves. It took an act of moral courage to do that, I think. Yes, he did grapple with it all his life. Why didn't he do it when he was president, when it might have had more impact? I think he was really concerned about the preservation of the Union, and he said he feared anything, that was the most important priority. And his fear was that if you tried to abolish slavery in the late 18th century, that there were many people who perhaps would have severed themselves from the Union. The Union would have broke apart over slavery. So that was a major concern for him. It was a political act on his part that may have consequences that would have been very deleterious for the Union. That's what he would have said, I think, in his own defense. Now, he saw some economic imperatives that he didn't want to get rid of slavery in his lifetime too, I think, as well.
Well, I would just like to say on a personal career note, he probably thought that it wouldn't have done the best for him in terms of his political aspirations. You have to imagine, as we're looking at the political realm of all politicians, that you just don't want to go but so far outside and take a risk beyond what you think you can control so that you can persevere. And I think that was a part of it too.
Great. Mrs. Tullis' class at Brandon High School in Brandon, Mississippi, asked what kinds of provisions did Washington make for his slaves in his will? ZSun-nee, would you like to answer that?
Well, actually, to tell you the truth, my family came through the dower slaves. So we came from the Custis family, and we were not provided for necessarily in his will. We were not freed. My ancestors were not freed until after his death. So that made it a little different. However, I think that there was great provision for the slaves who were, quote-unquote, his slaves, and I think Mr. Quander down there, Ruhulamin, can help you to understand more because his people were directly,
all the way
into
the 1830s is a reference to Suki Bey being old. I think it says blind, in need of care, and provisions were made pursuant to President Washington's will for her to have food and clothing, and some provision made for a nursing person to attend to her. So here, this is more than 30 years after he had died, and Suki Bey was still being cared for in her declining years. So it did continue, and we're grateful for that. I'll give him credit.
That's right.
Well, Edwin Rivera at nearby Mount Vernon High School in Alexandria sent us a question. It says, after Washington's death, in accordance with his will, all the slaves at Mount Vernon were to be released upon his wife Martha's death. Did Mrs. Washington release all the slaves early due to the fear of the overwhelming rebellion? Or was it just an act of gratitude and of grief due to the loss of her great husband? Dennis, you have a question about that?
Well, I think that's all really, yes, I do, really interesting. We have letters from folks who had met with Martha Washington soon after George Washington's death. Abigail Adams, for example, and she wrote to, I think, her sister, and she described her visit with Martha Washington, and she made it very clear that Martha Washington was concerned for her safety. Everybody knew that George Washington had called for his slaves to be freed in his will upon Martha Washington's death. How serious this threat was, who knows. But it seems pretty clear that she was interested in speeding up the manumission because she had 123 people whose freedom depended on her dying. And so it seems to me that it was a pretty good choice on her part.
Well, you also have to understand that some of the slaves belonged to General Washington and some belonged to the Custis family. So during the lifetime of General Washington, the families were kept together. But at the death of General Washington, his slaves were freed, but those who were perhaps married to the Custis slaves, were still there. So families were then split up. So I guess there was, some great urge on the part of the slaves that remained to, let's get this going because, my mate is now somewhere else. You know, this is hardship on an unimaginable level, because we don't think of things as being put on us in this way. We make decisions today as to whether to stay with a mate or not. You have no idea what it would mean to have someone forcibly take you away from someone that you love, unless you lived in a war-torn, area.
We have some audience questions from our students in the audience. James, what's your question?
My name is James Parker from Mount Vernon High School, and my question is, what role did your ancestors play at Mount Vernon?
Susan, how about you?
All right. My ancestor was Caroline Branham, and she was a personal maid of Martha Washington. That means that she took care of all of the personal needs of the First Lady. That was the first Lady. And also she helped with all of the visitors, cleaning the rooms, lighting the morning fire in the Washington's bedroom, just everything, waxing the candlesticks, waxing the floors, doing everything that had to be done within that home. And that meant 7 days a week many times, because visitors showed up with, quite regular visits. And it was kind of interesting back in that time, because visitors had no motels to stop with, so they actually had to just come by with a letter of recommendation from someone that the host would know. So the home was always filled with guests.
Now, the Quander ancestors were not in such a glamorous position. Most of them were working over at River Farm, and Nancy Carter Quander, for example, was a spinner, and of course making all sorts of cloth and fabric for whatever was required. But the Quander family is descended from several lines of people who were here in service: the Lears, the Carters. We have other names, Jasper and other names, several names. So different people were spread out at different places, and they were primarily in more manual and menial positions.
Well, we have another question from Brittany, who's from West Potomac High School.
Yes, my name is Brittany Boykin, and I do attend West Potomac High School. And my question is, West Potomac is located on Quander Road, and I was wondering, did this land originally belong to your family, and how did they acquire it?
Well, what happened is Charles Henry Quander, dairy farmer, worked for the Johnston family. And the Johnstons were friends of the Washingtons. I don't know the details right now. And when manumission came, they didn't tell him that he was free, and he worked quite a bit of extra time. And then when he found out, they paid him some money, and he used that money to purchase some land. And eventually, over time, he acquired 88 acres along the Quander Road area, or the area that is now Quander Road, in the Springbank area. And that land came into the family. I have to check the deeds, but I think in the 1870s up until the present time, and quite a bit of the land that's along Quander Road is still in the family, although public schools are on a portion of the rest of it.
We have another question from Melissa.
Hi, I'm Melissa Whalen from Mount Vernon High School, and my question is, were your ancestors freed after the death of General Washington, and if so, what did they do?
Well, let me just answer a little bit of that quickly. I've already answered part of it. They stayed in the area, primarily around Mount Vernon and in Fairfax County, and very quickly, when you check the records of registration of free Negroes in Fairfax County, you see they begin to emerge from farmers and laborers, and eventually become carriage drivers and butlers and cooks, and then the generation after that, teachers and preachers, down to the present generation. But predominantly, they stayed right there in the area. There's more than one branch of the family, but I'm speaking specifically about the ones that were in the Quander Road or Woodlawn and Springbank area. Thank you.
I would say about the same thing with my family. Of course, as I say, my family was released with the death or with the will of Mrs. Washington. I mean, her will, not an actual will. And I think that what we saw was attorneys, teachers, of course, naturally, butlers, I'm sure, cooks. But most of the history that I've come by would be the ministers and the lawyers and the teachers. Creating the first black library in Alexandria, which is still there today, named after Caroline's grandson, Robert Henry Robinson Library, and it's still there today. And so, the desire to excel the desire to become involved in politics as citizens to change the world and to change this country was something that I am so proud of, because I have ancestors, descendants also from Caroline, that were editors of newspapers and created, their own forums with readerships of like 5,000 to 6,000 to 8,000 in New York as well as in this area. So these are people that wanted to educate others, to edify them, to find out what could we do as a nation to come together. And this is a large step for people who came from an ancestor whose life was, so limited by others. I think it's a lesson. Every day I try to
Fantastic.
do that.
We have a question from Trina. Trina, what's your question?
Hi, my name is Trina from West Potomac High School, and my question is, given that your ancestors were slaves of George Washington, what do you think of him today?
I'm going to ask that our panelists give a brief, from both, starting with you, Ruhulamin, and then ZSun-nee.
Okay. I hold George Washington in high esteem. He was the father of our country, and he rightly earned that particular appellation, and I hold him in that. But at the same time, I recognize that none of us is perfect. We all could have done something differently. But in a sense, the fact that there's a Quander connection to Mount Vernon has been a great star in the feather of our family cap. I'm working on a book right now that's going to come out and talk about the Quander family history in detail. But I have a very positive impression of George Washington, recognizing him as a man of his time, a man of his day, and I hold him accountable, but, as I've explained earlier, not that accountable.
Very quickly, ZSun-nee.
How do I explain this to you? I can't. All I can tell you is that for whatever reasons there is in history, time, and space, I simply adore him and love him, and I cannot explain it to you, and I won't even try. I'll simply tell you that this is true, even though I love my ancestor, Caroline, and I do everything I can to bring her to the forefront in everything that I do. But that is the truth of it. I respect the man, I love him, and I'm just always glad to be in the presence of what he has done.
Thank you so much. That's all the time we have today. Thanks to all of our students, both here and the audiences around the country, who have asked such interesting questions about slavery in Mount Vernon. And thank you to our participants, Dr. Philip Morgan, Dennis Pogue, Mr. Ruhulamin Quander, Ms. ZSun-nee Matema. Thank you all for your thoughtful answers to those interesting questions. And thank you finally, Mount Vernon, for hosting this wonderful event. If you are going to be in the Washington, D.C. area, please consider visiting historic Mount Vernon. An enjoyable educational experience awaits at the galleries of the Donald W. Reynolds Museum and in the gardens and buildings of George Washington's beautiful home. I'm Larry Earl. Thank you for joining us for a look at slavery at Mount Vernon.